think I'm going to do territorial acknowledgement that we are gathered on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, and Musqueam people, and that we are grateful to be here as guests or whatever relationship we are here. And yeah, I'll come back to the question of territorial acknowledgements when we talk about the foreshore, because it became kind of an important thing in my thinking as we were moving through the planning of those events and organizing them. Yeah, that's all.
I think it's probably important that we maybe introduce other sites a little bit more in depth before we jump right into Foreshore. We're here in the context of the Blue Cabin exhibition. Other Sites is one of the 3 organizations alongside Grunt and C3 that are responsible for the remediation and the restoration of the cabin. And Barbara Cole and Marco Simsik, another member of Other Sites, are 2 leads on that. Jen and I are, it's important to say that Other Sites operates as a collective. So Jen and I are here as representatives of the collective, but we by no means are encompassing what Other Sites is or does. And we come to it each with very distinct skills and investment in the organization. So the projects that we're going to talk about to introduce the, the organization, my mind just went blank. Anyway, the pieces that I'll talk about to introduce the organization are actually not projects that I have worked on directly. They're actually projects of Lorna Brown, who's here, hello Lorna, and Barbara Cole, but I will do my best to summarize them, and then we will obviously, if there's other things to add from the floor, please do. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the Foreshore with specifics, and Jen was was instrumental in the creation of that discussion event, so we'll talk about that and its relationship to the Blue Cabin. So by way of usually whenever we talk about Other Sites, it's always really productive to talk a bit about our mandate. So this is the only kind of text that I'll read, but Other Sites projects consider the aesthetic, economic, and regulatory conditions of public spaces and public life. Operating as a Vancouver-based collective, Other Sites creates a presence for art and spaces and sites that are accessible to a broad public. And current producer-curators are Lorna Brown, Barbara Cole, Colin Griffiths, Vanessa Kwan, Marco Simsik, and Jen Weih. And our general manager is Subjan Fair, who's also here tonight.
Yeah, new and fabulous general manager.
So we were formed in 2005. Is that right? Yeah, 2004, 2005. And Other Sites has never held a space in the city. It's always been an organization that has had circulates within different spaces, and we hold our meetings in studios, but we've never actually had a kind of storefront presence in the city. And all of the projects that have been produced by Other Sites thus far have been kind of spearheaded by particular members, so we work on a project-by-project basis. So we diverge a little bit from the kind of operating model of many artist-run organizations, and then we don't have everyday operations. We really kind of existed up until now as in kind of provisional way to support very particular projects. So there was always a driving purpose for a particular project to be born, and then it would be executed, and then we would move on to the next project. And so all the projects are temporary in nature. The 3 that I wanted to talk about, one of the things that we think and talk about a lot are regulatory conditions and how the city interacts with temporary public artworks, and then what kind of interactions and situations are engendered by the placement of particular kinds of public work. And so the 3 pieces that we have here, I would say, indicative of some of the ways in which the work that Other Sites does creates a real frame for seeing the regulatory conditions that control our experience of public life. And those things really fed into our deep interest in the Blue Cabin and our deep interest in the Foreshore as a discursive platform as well, but we will get to that. So the first project is called When the Hosts Come Home, and it's by 2 artists from Berlin named William Kohlwasser, curated by Barbara Cole in 2012. So next image. So this image is, of course, going to be very, very familiar to anyone in the room. This is not very far from here. It's just over at the Linwood Village. And I like to show this image as a framing one because it is so much about seeing Vancouver as we expect to see it. This is one of the sort of iconic views of Vancouver and its False Creek. the kind of like meeting of water and land as a kind of as a very emblematic experience in the city, and of course the view. So the view is being incredibly important here. So this the piece in question is the bulldozer.
Yeah, no, of course. I thought I was helping you, but I'm not.
This is the bulldozer structure in close-up. And so essentially, in broad strokes, this was a sculpture that Colin and Kalfusser made from a waste material that came out of the Olympic Village development. So there was wheat board that was covering a lot of the higher-end appliances and countertops that were built into the Olympic Village condos, so that when the athletes stayed there during the Olympics, there was no damage done to these materials. And so when they left, they took all the materials out, and then the hosts moved in. So essentially the people who bought the condos in the pre-sale then moved in after the athletes were there. So this was a waste material. It's biodegradable. The artists wanted to use it as a way of showing some of this process, some of those kind of like those exchanges and productions and fabrications that were part of that process of inhabiting those spaces. And so they created this structure, and it was filled with dirt. So the structure itself was quite, as you can see, quite pristine in the beginning, and then over the course of many months, being on the seawall, which, as you know, is a very visible place. It's a place that many thousands of people would circulate daily, many people multiple times a week. So the viewership of this was actually very high, and it became this kind of strange and idiosyncratic presence on the seawall that was like kind of constantly becoming a little bit rougher and rougher and rougher until we're kind of like reaching this state of decay. So it's one of these like projects that questions very seriously the role of a kind of monument in the city, and how we might consider that art, when placed in the city, is also changing, as is the city. So this evolution in this conversation became very, very important, and I think is really, really critical to how other sites invest itself in public artworks that are temporary in nature. Eventually, it became a garden because of the dirt inside. So it sort of dissolved to a point of being quite a large berm, and this gardener took it over, and for one summer, it became an incredibly active, rich food garden. And at a certain point, because of, this is also where Cavalia and like, that big horse show, that's Cavalia.
It is Cavalia.
It's basically where Cavalia is. So the city became increasingly irritable with this no longer tidy art, and eventually it was bulldozed in a great irony. And so it was just taken away under the cover of night. So it became this kind of like, it was fine for a time, and then the regulatory conditions of the space kind of closed in, and it was like, now you've got to go. So that was the situation. That Barbara, did you want to add anything? The next work that I'll talk about is Digital Natives, which was done in 2011, which was the year after the Olympics, and it was the 125th anniversary of the city of Vancouver, and lead curators were Warren Brown and Clint Barnum. Digital Natives, again, this was an opportunity to work with a very unusual site in the city. So it was a piece that was made very specifically for this billboard, which exists on Squamish territory. It's right next to the Burrard Street Bridge. Some of you may know this history, but essentially there's a very small packet of land which is Squamish territory, which allows this billboard to exist in contravention to the City of Vancouver bylaws around kind of size and light pollution. And that package of land has a history that parallels the building of the City of Vancouver. So 125 years ago, it would have been a kind of parcel of land which was much bigger, and which was designated as the city kind of like, as the railway kind of came through, this package of land would have been kind of bisected and allowed at a certain point. And then as the city grew and there were more kind of colonial rights of way or city-based municipal rights of way, the package shrank and shrank and shrank till it was incredibly small. So this is a very, very small package of land which persists as a kind of reminder of settler and First Nations relationship on this land, and what really very clearly is the tension and the cost of the city having grown up over the past 125 years around it. So this work was was framed as an invitation to a number of different native and non-native writers, scholars, critics, and artists who would submit text, which would be broadcast in between the advertising that was normally happening on the screen. So those texts were kind of tweet length, about 140 characters, and many of them would address settler-colonial relationship, the nature of anniversaries such as the 145th anniversary, some of, I guess, the situation of the city. It was really just a way to address advertising, language, the city, and all of these things as they mixed up together in this advertising format. And so they would flash up in these kind of like very particular red backgrounds. And all of the tweets were also translated into Squamish language. And Squamish language at that time, and I'm not sure exactly if it's the same at this point, but there were very, very few native speakers. And there has been a lot of focus on language revitalization within the Squamish language community, but at that time it was something that was not necessarily well known, and probably still not at this point. But there would have been very few native speakers that would actually see this. And so one of the questions I think that came out of this was when we're asking, who are we addressing with the public? What does language mean in public space? Who gets to understand, and what does that mean? And these actually caused a certain amount of anxiety in people. So people would see this language that they didn't understand, that was unfamiliar, and would kind of promote some curiosity and some questions and eventually some complaints. So there were a number of tweets that were censored. And so one of the, some of them up front, you'll see here, it says Imperial Canada awarded sex abuse to Native youth by the Black Robes, now proudly bestows bronze, silver, gold medals with Indian image. So some of them are kind of not mincing words about the hypocrisy of the settler colonial context in which we live. One of them was just death to the sign, which many people thought was a threat. And then so they were pulled down eventually by Astro Media to control the content for that screen. So again, it was one of these moments where the regulatory conditions of this site, which we might normally not really think about in our fairly rapid transit across this bridge, it really brought up a lot of the tensions that exist around this particular site and around the context of the city. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, that's good.
And then the last project that I'll talk about is Deadhead, and this will lead a little bit more clearly into the Foreshore discussion. So this is a work by Cedric Nathan and Jim Bomford. Again, lead curator was Martin Cole. This is what the work looked like on the water. It was a floating artwork, essentially, that existed in the waterways around Vancouver for the summer of 2014.
Just the summer.
Yes, but it was actually a multi-year process of building, an improvisational process to a point. It's a father, two sons and a father. The father is an engineer and the sons are both artists. And so they would work together to create these forms, which were all kind of inspired by provisional architecture, I suppose, and some some natural formations. Like Deadhead actually refers to like a piece of a stump that's just under the water and can be very dangerous to boaters. So it's a kind of like an obstacle, and a kind of like ugly obstacle that might exist below the surface of the water. So inherently the artists were quite interested in these sort of like things. Yeah, no.
Also, they did research on residential schools, like the vernacular architecture of the West Coast, but then also they went to Alert Bay and they worked with a guy whose name I forget right now, who's an architectural historian at UBC, who actually, in court, when you give evidence to convince the court that the architectural design of residential schools was genocidal in intent, the way that the buildings were designed and the windows, how people were allowed to move, not move through different spaces. So that's also part of what's informing the way the things are designed, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I guess that's the reason point. Like I think that some of the ways that the forms came together were very much about this kind of like curiosity and provision, but then also very much rooted in the language and institutional power. And so there'd be these moments like from the turrets, like these kind of like crow's nest pieces or these things that would be more familiar to like institutional structures that were based on kind of control. Within the context of their studio, we started creating these discussion events. This is Jen leading a discussion event in the Balford studio. And this was one of the first times I think we started thinking very seriously about conversation in the context of artists building and making in public space, and how that might add to the processes itself. And Deadhead was launched on the water, and we continued to do events where it was moored. So this is where it was near Vandy Park. And then people were welcomed onto the structure at different intervals and also for special events. So this is a choral performance by the Vancouver Chamber Choir. So there was a whole series of thematic programming that existed on Deadhead and allowed the public to kind of engage with the structure and then also have different kinds of interdisciplinary experiences and discursive events. This is a sunset performance with Ellen Markle on trombone. I think that's twice. And then that, there was something I was supposed to mention about Deadhead. Oh, jurisdiction.
Oh, yeah.
So one of the things about the water, which I know continues to fascinate us and the team on the Blue Cabin, is that at certain, the regions of the city are quite closely controlled as long as you're on land. But once you're in the water, there's a number of different things that happen. One of them is that the jurisdictions become very, very muddy. So people, there's certain rights of way that has to happen, and there's certain things that you have to do to keep kind of safety protocol. But as far as like who owns this space, there's really nobody that can control a certain patch of water. So one of the things that came up with this location at Magnet Park was that it's in a very established neighborhood with people who have very strong ideas of what their view should look like. And so there was a bid from the neighborhood association to have this thing evicted and removed. And Jen was speaking earlier about this meeting that she was at, where essentially,
yeah, Barbara and I met with the. They were petitioning the Maritime Museum to get us to move, to get it gone, because it was hosted by the Maritime Museum. And he was really quite amazing. He was like, there's nothing that even I can do. You're not attached to the dock of the Maritime Museum. I can't make you move it. No one can really do this. You're beyond the jurisdiction of the city. You're beyond the jurisdiction of the museum. So that opening that we had no idea it existed, right? That there was a different set of regulatory conditions, like sort of like almost like a vacuum of regulatory conditions in this space where this artwork was, and that we had this sort of fantastical conversation with the off-duty RCMP officer who was like, screw them, really, like these rich people want you to move this thing and there's nothing they can do about it. It was really wonderful and inspiring, and part of what got us thinking about the possibilities or the questions around water and jurisdiction. Where are the spaces that are unregulated? How can we push for this idea?
And also, I think some of the conversations around how these projects and other ones that we have been involved in, I think have really prompted a different consciousness on our part around how artists and curators and architects and writers can be more involved in the discussions around how the city comes up around us. So when we have to engage with the regulatory conditions just to get a piece of art up, it makes us have to hone skills around negotiating with different jurisdictional bodies. So that's one of the things that I think has kind of fed into our interest in some of these discursive events, because those were also kind of, I think we were also at a certain point, we were trying to go over our chronology, we got interested in being more involved as a kind of communications body in the city, to talk about issues that were happening around us and that were relevant to us as citizens and as artists. And so how are we going to shift from just like projects to this kind of exploration, like a co-exploration with the public around some of the questions that were coming up as we were trying to produce some of these projects. So jurisdiction was one of them, and then development was another. And so, yeah, I'm going to
Trade. Yeah, so so that's our general introduction to the organization, the kind of works that we've been doing. Now I'm going to head towards the Foreshore in particular, but do a little bit of a long tail leading our introduction or beginning how we got engaged in discursive events. And yeah, I know what I want, like coming out of this moment of working on Deadhead, where we were actively working on the water. We were also, the communications office, one of this, we actually called sort of thinking of this project as a communications office, thinking about seawater rise, sea level rises. And there was a series of talks that happened at the Western Front that we called Future is Floating, which also had a dimension that was interviews with artists about the condition along the Main Street corridor and in Mount Pleasant and the transformations that people were seeing and experiencing with the pressures of development on this area. And then sort of coming out of that research, and then that was the moment of rise. So the discussions and the contestation over the size of the rise development, the existence of the rise development, the blatant disregard for the community plan of the rise development got us wanting to explore the possibility of a community being directing what was arising in its space. So I know what I want was sort of, we called it a, we set up an artist studio in the mall. So we were thinking of it as a kind of community consultation, but in the very like open studio kind of format. So we were canvassing people who were coming by about what they wanted to see in the neighborhood. What would they like? What was their dream? And some of the things that people were asking for were very concrete and specific, and some of them were much more poetic and playful. The artichoke of democracy is one of them. Monument to Mysterious Fires is another. People thinking about the fires that had happened in and around the Main and Broadway intersection over time. And
yeah, there's like a sculpture park, there's a food garden,
there's a pony rides, there's like
and we were also using materials from the dollar store to create these.
Yeah, it was all produced by us, hanging out in Kingsgate Mall, using materials from the dollar store, and casually having conversations with people. So how can we both engage in a conversation that is not sort of directive, but plays with an open and creative approach to thinking about what it looks like to have agency inside your own community, which is like the name of the project, I Know What I Want, proposes this possibility. And to sort of tie back for a moment and point to one of the really interesting presentations that happened as part of the Future Exploding, Annabelle Vaughn, who's an architect who now lives in Toronto, is based here, presented about a number of projects in Toronto that are community-driven development projects. So there is a model that exists in this world where buildings are built for specific communities to meet their specific needs, and they, through whatever, whether one was a union, one was an elder, like hostis, not hostis, but like elder housing, and there are other models, basically, like this situation that we're here, we exist in here, where people who have a lot of resources get to make decisions and design and build buildings that then become the housing stock that we're all stuck with at the price that they find beneficial to themselves isn't the only way that it goes. So I Know What I Want came out of that sort of set of inquiries. And then really, I would say...
Can you talk a bit about the result of those inquiries?
Well, It was a poetic gesture. There wasn't like out of the future is floating. We created a document that we submitted to the city, but there wasn't. I mean, unless wait, I do hear you making.
I'm sorry,
say something.
Well, do you have do you have more insights that you brought to your collective, and that then changed your stance because you did so much very specifically oriented community consultation?
Well, the community consultation document that we submitted to the city is now part of the, would have to be referred to in any subsequent public consultation.
In that neighborhood?
In that neighborhood. So it is registered within the city as a bona fide consultation.
And that's because
other people
other sites submitted it, or the city asked for it, or
well,
how did it get legitimized?
I can't remember whether they asked for it, but we submitted it, and so it becomes part of the register of consultations within the neighborhood. You know, an idiosyncratic one, but one that people, when subsequent consultation consultants registered with the planning department, then it goes into the archive and is on record.
And as far as it was, that I think the Foreshore constitutes a continuation of that investigation. I'm going to start, just give it a bit of a frame by reading the description that we were working with and the questions that were informing how we approached organizing the talks. The Foreshore describes the land along the edge of the water that is both submerged and revealed by the tide. Very simply, it is the wet part of the beach. The Foreshore is a place of unclear jurisdiction and thus of contestation, friction, and constant movement. Those who dwell in this zone must continually adapt to a changing environment. The Foreshore also conjures histories specific to this region, narratives of trade and exchange, habitation and nourishment, resistance and violent erasure. It might similarly evoke our contemporary lived situation in this place. Considering the potential of this zone as both concept and site, the Foreshore Initiative asks the following. How do we generate conditions of emergence? How can we take up space differently? How do we support unruly practices and futures? The Foreshore exists at the edge of the city. Can we bring it to the center? Can there be land that is not property? And what is as yet unseen? So, in collaboration with Kimberly, who was at Access at the time, which is the gallery in Chinatown, and they had this annex space that was available, which looks like this, which we painted pink. And we had this opportunity to use that space for a season from October till June. And the conversation that we had been having as other sites and then initiating with Kimberly brought us to wanting to explore using this metaphor of the Foreshore to excavate more deeply into these questions about what is going on in the city, what are the possibilities, how might we begin to imagine this stuff differently. So like I was interested in coming back to some of these questions, right? So how do we generate the conditions of emergence? That to me, when we were trying to decide what to pull in, was part of what informed this very multidisciplinary collection of speakers that we brought in. So we had people who were PhDs in political science, artists, philosophers, poets, dramaturges and playwrights, community singing activists, architects, public artists, biologists. So just like a really wide diversity. And I was sort of, I don't know how to describe the work of being a project lead, because I was really just sort of holding things, because we get together and all of the other sites, people would have different wonderful ideas about the interesting people that they know, and Kimberly and everybody sort of feeding in possible speakers. And it was going every 2 weeks we were planning them, and we decided to plan them as it went so that it could respond to itself, that it was constantly sort of digesting its own path and then being informed by it. So it was happening on the fly, and the sort of like pool of people were presenting to me, and then I was like, well, okay, what would be really interesting, and what are the relationships that are resonating with each other, but that maybe aren't as obvious as you might expect. So this is where you get Will Plowright, who's doing his PhD in political science about insurgents, jihadist insurgents in West Africa, and Lai Wan speaking about her art practice with Barnacle City, and Donna Haraway staying with the Trouble. And like, he wrote me an email and he was like, why am I speaking with, I don't understand this relationship. And I was like, I think it's going to be good, because you're both looking at things like it's like right in that term, staying with the Trouble, because he's interested in listening carefully to the stories, like how do people end up in this position where it makes sense to be participated in jihadist movement. And she's the Donna Haraway question of staying with the Trouble, like what are the difficult things that we don't want to look at. I was like, that's what this guy is doing. So though that's, I think, a really good example. Yeah, of course.
It's super interesting to me to revisit this moment, because I'm just recalling now, like in the organizing of it, really felt like it was like this like a wobbling souffle that was going to just just lose it. And but it helps me also to remember that concurrently, Barbara and Glenn and Esther were having a lot of discussions, and me to the side, because I work with both Grunt and other sites. I was kind of like involved in a lot of these discussions around what a collaboration looks like. What does an institutional framework look like for something we haven't done yet? So to me, like, those things are very linked, and like how we imagine our institutions can operate, how we imagine our structures and our systems can be built from the ground up, but it begins, or I think it begins with these kind of like really tenuous relationships that so slowly become more, they slowly gain form, I guess. And so there was like, the Cabin Committee was coming together, the Foreshore was just kind of like doing its thing, and those two things for me were really like.
Yeah, no, totally. And to me, like, one of the things also when I went back and read through all my notes, the frequency with which people spoke about the importance of personal relationships in the work that they did, some kind of connection that was possible, all these, like, just was a thematic that arose very frequently. So to bring together, that was a dimension of it, was the mixing of demographics. So you get people who are interested, drawn to Denise Da Silva Rivera, who's working at the Social Justice Institute at UBC, and then dancers who are really interested in what Justine Chambers does, and they're all in the room together talking about decolonizing language. So like that kind of thing was happening, and it was, that to me is the sort of generating the conditions of emergence. And form also, like, take up space differently. This would show up in very many different ways, I think, but one of the things that I thought was really important about the project is that we sat around that big table. A few of us, sometimes it was really intimate, and sometimes it was kind of packed in there. And we had chips and wine, and it was informal. So I tried to facilitate, as to the best of my ability, a situation that people felt really comfortable. And the form was that the speakers would speak for about 15 minutes each, and we'd have little Q&As after each one, and then there was a big chunk of time where it was general discussion with the group that was there. So the format was designed to create a multi-point exchange, not a two-point or like this kind of form, right? And yeah, how do we support unruly practices in future? We thought about politics a lot. Donald Trump was elected like 2 months into this thing. Sure, yeah, I didn't follow the order that the slides are in. This is what it looks like when people are in the foreshore. That's one of the busy ones. This is a really busy one. I think maybe the photographs where you're going to see are more busy ones. Yeah. We had a feast at the end. When I was trying to decide what to do at the end, it seemed we need to get as many people together who've been regular attendees and participants and share food. I'm going to come back around now that I'm where I am to that at the end. Yeah, so just this question of the relationships between poetics and politics was something that was weaving in and out of the decision-making process all the time. And like this notion of edges, right? The foreshore, the constantly shifting, fertile, dangerous, possible space of possibility, but also different kinds of destruction and loss. So how does that inform that metaphor resonate with what it looks like to be at the edge of an art practice? Like what are the edges of art practices and where do they start to meet other kinds of things that are happening? And how can those things start to knit? In through another Other Sites project, a symposium that was at the Western Front called Urgent Imagination. And in the closing session, Jeff Dirksen said, well, you know, we really need to think about what it would look like for the art community to work in a large degree of solidarity in relationship to these issues. And that was one of the things that this question of emergence, but also like how different kinds of things can start to knit together, something that was in my mind as things were moving through. And then coming back to the land acknowledgement, I became very interested in the question of what does it mean to be good guests, right? So I started giving these land acknowledgements every week or every 2 weeks, and the question of being good guests, how do we do that? What does that actually look like? Because we acknowledge that we're on these unceded territories, but the acknowledgement is sort of an empty gesture if you're not following it up with some kind of searching to do something about that. What does it look like to grapple with that question? So I feel like that was another thematic that was in the mix of the things that we were talking about. And yeah, just to give, well, how are we doing for time?
I think we're fine.
I'm still it's the blue cabinet section.
I think we're,
so I'll just
everybody seems to be engaged, so I think we're good.
I'll just give like, just a couple little snapshots of some of the kinds of things that were presented.
We're at like 35 minutes, just so you know, yeah.
Okay.
If that helps at all.
Sure. So yes, just to give you an idea of what some of the thematics were, and maybe the website. There it is. We have a website, and most all of the talks are on this website. So you can go and listen to them while you're making your breakfast or whatever. And we also have, you can subscribe to the Other Sites newsletter on this website or on our other real websites. So we would love to have you on our email list if you're interested at all. Just a little aside. So yeah, I talked about by Juan and Will Plowright. Carmen Palia is an artist in town. He characterizes himself as a non-visual learner, and he's very connected to, or his practice is focused on questions of accessibility. And what does it look like to engage in a relational model for accessibility that sets a precedent or focuses on the expertise, the knowledge, sort of the articulated needs of the people looking for support, as opposed to being articulated by those who are positioning themselves as though providing support. So ask the people who are the experts in their own conditions. And he was listening, or not listening, considering or looking at it through the question of, considerations of agency and power in relationship to the disabling social, cultural, and political conditions in any given context. So his work is quite diverse. He's done projects in New Orleans where he uses an entire marching band instead of a white cane to navigate through space. It's a collective of people in through Gallery Gachet. They did an accessibility audit of the Vancouver Art Gallery, which, as you might imagine, did not do so well. And they're thinking about these things expansively, right? So it's not just physical accessibility, but social, economic, cultural accessibility. So he spoke, and then with him on that same day, Michelle Tung spoke, who works with the Upper Fraser First Nations. Currently, that's where she's working, I think. I don't know if she's still there. Upper Fraser First Nations. This is the language she gave me. Sorry. That's okay. And I mean, I guess that's, well, whatever. To help them with their negotiations over land and resource management. So she provides insight and facilitates the translation of their knowledge into frameworks that are legible to the corporations, but also the environmental assessment bodies, so that they can make the case and have it heard so that their environments can be protected. So they're sort of both thinking about questions of accessibility, but coming at it from very different ways. And another example of a pairing an evening was Marcus Youssef. Thank you. Marcus Youssef, who was a playwright and who had been collaborating and working on playwriting with artists with Down syndrome, and his speaking about what it looks like to let those who are usually followers, let them lead. How do you really step back and not, in a situation like that, not be in a position of a kind of management, just really acknowledge the skills that are in the room. And Vanessa Richards, who is she works with community choirs, and she talks about unsilencing ourselves and the power implicit in finding our voices and song in everyday life. And she thinks about these things in a very expansive way. So those are some of the examples, just a couple of the pairings that happened. So that's the discursive part of the Foreshore project. And then, yeah, we also, because the space, we were using it to meet in, and we were having these events every 2 weeks, and it was available the rest of the time. So we invited 3 different artists to do artist residencies in there. So this is Guadalupe Martinez, who was occupying this space during the winter, and she did, with Zoe Cry, did a movement, drawing, sensing workshop. And she facilitated sort of curated a couple of dance performances. And this is Juliana Chappell doing an iterative, she moved across the floor the same way but differently many, 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 many times. It was really beautiful. This is from Kara Uzelman's residency. She came out, she lives in Tacoma, Saskatchewan, but she came and was working on the idea of working with her community in Saskatchewan to produce a kind of publication that was working with local knowledge. And this is just artifacts or sort of like ephemera from the research that she was doing while she was in residence. And then also Carol Sawyer was artist in residence also. And the main product that came out of that was that she was doing research about singers that were living in Chinatown at the time, and then she did a performance with John Oliver, informed by her reflections on the community and also on the foreshore. She lives near Chinatown, right at the edge of False Creek. So False Creek Flats, which of course used to be the foreshore. So we had these three residents, but simultaneously we had a kind of overarching residency with Justin Lanois, who is a local artist, works a lot, he works in public space and social practice. And we would have studio sessions with each one of our artists. So, and slow down. We'd workshop there, whatever they wanted to talk about. We would sit down and talk with them about it. And he came to those sessions, and then he made works in response to those conversations. And this was one of them. And then he also made, he made temporary tattoos and a series of gifts. So he made us different, a different little work, text-based work for each one of those studio sessions. And that was actually a really wonderful part of the project, having those studio sessions that were brainstorming, thinking together a specific dimension or question at stake in an artist project. It was really, really fruitful and satisfying, productive. And that might be the end of the foreshore. Yeah, I think, it's still going on. There's still some foreshore sites, foreshore events that are happening. We had still a little bit of funding left over, and we moved them. The access space no longer exists. It's been integrated into access. And so we started having them, and Kimberly went to the CAG also. So we're now partnering with the CAG, presenting these events, and we've been hosting them in Vancouver in public libraries. So this one is at the Sismont Library down in Strathcona, the new one, and we've had one at the one on Main, I don't know what they call that, Kingsgate Library? It's probably not called that. That's what I would call it. That library up the hill, and we invited back folks who really made an impression upon us last year, and then we're putting them in conversation. If they had a specific person they wanted to invite, or if there was a pairing that presented itself. So this night was Carmen Papalia with Julene Parent-C, and Julene actually had come to one of the events. The last time she was friends with Cynthia Brooke, who was presenting about the foreshore, longshore, and she is super knowledgeable, and she has Asian and Indigenous descent, and she talked about the history of Indigenous labor on the foreshore. was talking more about his open access project, because he's looking to, he wants an office in the city, like he wants to make his project about accessibility into a city institution, which is going to happen. Like, he's going to make it happen. Actually, he's very determined and very, it's already starting to happen. So it's great. Oh yeah, and then we invited back Cole Thrush, who is a historian working at UBC, looking at cities as tools of settler colonialism, but also at survivance, the resistance and perseverance of Indigenous culture within those contexts. So he came back, and he invited Kamala Todd to speak with him, and they spoke about what does it look like to really begin to work towards conditions of reconciliation, responsibility to Indigenous title in these places. It was also super, super wonderful talk. And then we had one last one that was Dan Plaxton and Jolene Mansour talking about their shared research that investigates lens-based work, the photographic work of Dan's photographic work, but then also relationships to the longshore, Indigenous relationship to the longshore workers. And we're working on one more, which will happen in the fall. And yeah, so now Vanessa is going to bring it back to the relationship to the Blue Cabin.
Yeah, so as you can see, Foreshore was a very unruly project, I would say. There's a lot of danglers, there's a lot of threads. And it's still continuing as it's going to be this series of talks, there's going to be some sound pieces that come out of it, and some kind of like resonating or rippling things that will continue to be produced in the next couple of years probably. And it's continuing to influence our thinking at other sites around what our future is as an organization and how we might want to evolve into the future. And one of the major projects, of course, on the roster is the Blue Cabin, which Barbara and Marco have been working on really intensely for the last couple of years. And the Blue Cabin, I just think, everyone here is going to be very familiar with the Blue Cabin, so obviously I won't really go into that as a project, but as a kind of creative fermentation, it's been really productive for us to think about what it is, how we might situate ourselves creatively on a kind of foreshore. What does it mean to be on that wet part of the beach? How might we adjust ourselves to changing conditions of environment, of politics, of culture, of our own selves, trying to readjust to new ways of understanding things, new ways of building knowledge. And all of these things flow into what I would say are richer institutions. So one thing that I find incredibly fascinating about the Blue Cabin is that it's a completely implausible project. It doesn't make any sense. It's not an owned structure. No one can actually, because it's never been owned, but it persists, and it inspires this kind of like identification with it because of that, I think. And so you'll find people from all different communities finding this project incredibly rich. And so there's something very special about this situation of being on the foreshore, of being kind of outside of jurisdiction and still persisting. And so what I love about this collaboration that is coming together through other sites in Grunt and C3 is that it is an implausible project, and yet it exists, and yet it is getting funding, and yet it will be a residency within the course of a year. So I feel like those things are kind of the core of what in my personal opinion is just so hopeful, I guess, about this moment in time, is that a lot of things are in flux, but there are ways that we are forming these new kinds of alliances, and I think the Foreshore is trying to poke at that, like poking at how can we make different kinds of alliances, how can we be in solidarity, how can we be better guests, how do we do this differently and still persist with structures that will work. I mean, that's the thing, So this is hopefully one of those things, and will stand in my mind as a good example of that. So, good.
Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening. Questions, comments?
What's C3?
Creative cultural collaborations. So Esther Rosenberg is the executive director, and they essentially run the East Side Culture for All. So they're on here to collaborate.
Yeah, and you mentioned, and I should say, that we are in the process of having a series of editors, and being one of them, working on podcast audio works that will draw on the recordings of the Foreshore sessions, and they are scheduled to be, they'll be done by the end of September. There'll be a launch at the Western Front, and there'll be our website and the Western Front website, and iTunes and stuff like that. So there'll be really interesting ways of experiencing the network, because the editors are drawing from various different talks as well as audio works made by participants in the Foreshore, and then other material that they want to feed into it. So they're really like elaborate constellations. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning, but is there a planned location now for the Blue Cabin?
Cabin?
Yeah, or is that still being?
It's, Barbara, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, that's being worked out. So the vision, I think, is that the Blue Cabin would be moored in relation to different foreshores. That's the long-term goal. The first 2 years, while it's getting off the ground, we're through practicalities, I think, to some degree, concentrating on False Creek because it's really urban. Traction there, attractive funding perhaps. Calmer waters, yeah. But even within that, we're looking at applications within False Creek, possibly Coal Harbor as well. But this idea that as a residency, different artists eventually would be able to choose from a number of potential mooring sites, and with each of those sites, relationships to particular communities or networks. So, for example, if it was moored in Indian Arm, and the relationship to the Swahili-Tooth there, past histories, present-day realities, marine health. There's a number of things that each location conjures. And so the idea would be that we would stack up those artists who are interested in that as a kind of a context for their research, and in part to cut down on how often it would move, because it's very costly to move it. So maybe it'd be over there for a year, maybe it'd be False Creek for a year, that kind of move is what we're thinking.
Can I ask a question about audience and audiences?
Yeah.
Because it seems to me one of the dilemmas with the Blue Cabin is, and imagining it as an artist residency, is artists aren't always that interested in sharing what they do with a large public or with a public audience. Yet it seems to me that funding agencies are really concerned with who attendance and how many people are at something and numbers and those kinds of things. And how do you imagine you're going to reconcile this to, I guess, what I'll characterize as a dilemma, or a point of tension where, as an artist, you often want privacy, yet funding agencies often want very public events. And has that become how have we been dealing with that?
I think that from my limited attendance at some of the cabin discussions and all that, it feels like we'll have each artist will be encouraged to do a public engagement piece, but I don't think it doesn't have to be all the time. So maybe there might be one instance of an artist talk where we invite the public to see that particular practice, and if that's not in the interest of the artist, there's other opportunities when the Blue Cabin, for instance, is not being used as a residency for them to be other kinds of engagement opportunities that come along. So maybe we use those kind of fallow moments where we welcome people onto projects want to see public engagement, and many are exclusively about public engagement, so, yeah. Is that?
Yeah, I would say that. I mean, the history of the cabin is extremely important. I mean, in as much as the foreshore as a metaphor is very important, but also the histories that the cabin itself represents can also be a real catalyst for bringing people together. Again, multidisciplines, different kinds of interests. So there is a lot of discussion about how do we make that history evident. So whether that's a dedicated website, whether it's screens, whether it's some kind of public engagement that actually exposes that history and uses that history as a metaphor. For occupation, for accommodation, for affordable living, for squatting, for how people have used the foreshore as an affordable option to Vancouver's history of being speculative.
I think the other thing too was the way Deadhead functioned as an eyesore for a lot of people. The kind of anti-spectacle of the cabin just being present in the distance, or what, you know, it will have a presence, and it in the kind of seamlessness of Vancouver, an anomaly just being there is already, I think, you know, functions as a kind of art in itself.
I think one of the great things about Deadhead, if I could just continue, is that you had to take a tiny boat to get to it, or row over to it. What I like about this rendering is that it's off the shore, it's not moored against the dock, and there's no kind of bridge on board, so I would imagine is that